So when will the global economy recover? This is a fundamental question as we're sitting here in April 2009. The fact of the matter is that the global downturn has already been underway for more than 2 years. Back in October 2007, the winds of change were clearly there, and we are a long, long way through that process now. One thing is certain, you can't pump $3 trillion into the global economy without something starting to turn. And when it does, you can be sure that we will overshoot on the other side. Governments have been pathologically afraid of the power of deflation to destroy their future. Why? Because as prices fall, we find that banks have even less assets to hold against their liabilities, and so we go into further downward cycles. We also find that people, as we saw in Japan, hold off their own spending because they expect every price to be cheaper tomorrow. So it kills the economy. Now, while we have had deflation, and we will see deflation, it's certainly not going to last very long. The only reason we have seen deflation is because of a few things which have been chugging their way through the system where prices fell dramatically. And of course, the main one was oil. When we saw the oil prices fall, they came down from $145 a barrel down to well below $50 a barrel. That can only happen once. You can't have $50 a barrel going down to $10 a barrel. Well, I suppose you could, but it's not very likely. And already we've seen a rebound. There's another thing which can only happen once, which is the running down of stocks. Yes, it's all very well for companies to wind back their production, and they can go on utilizing the stocks that are hanging around their warehouse, that are in wholesalers and so on, or sitting in retailer shelves. But eventually those stocks get used up. And those stocks had been largely used up by early 2009. You can only run down your stocks once. And there are other examples of this where things go through the system just once. For example, house prices. You can have house prices fall by 20 or 30 or 40%, but they can't go on falling by another 20, 30, 40%, and then another 20, 30, 40%. Eventually it has to stabilize, and as it does, you start to see some of the inflationary things that have been there all along come back into the frame. So we can expect this world, in our joined up globalized society, to turn a corner and to become inflationary again. As soon as demand begins to pick up, we will see oil prices increase quite sharply, because the fundamentals of the balance between oil supply and demand were not changed. Yes, of course, in the middle of the downturn there was a little bit of surplus capacity and people were worried about what future oil prices would be. But we still have a situation where the population is growing, the number of people in emerging economies is that are affluent, well-educated, and so on is growing. The number of people who are going to want to drive their own cars and so on is growing. The amount of infrastructure that is being built around the world is growing. The population will increase from 6.7 billion to 9 billion people. You know, these things are set in concrete. They are unavoidable realities. There will be pressures, continuous pressures, sustainability pressures on every aspect of our environment, of resources. It doesn't matter whether it's food, whether it's precious metals, whether it's iron ore, whether it's the amount of concrete needed to be poured into the ground. We will see a return of the same challenges that were there in our world in 2005, 2006, 2007, before the downturn began. So we are in a cycle, and the cycle will change. And when it does, we will go into growth. We will see inflation kick in as all this additional amount of money that's been poured by governments into the system finally has its effect in devaluing what an individual pound or a dollar or a euro will buy. That is inflation. And as that happens, we will see interest rates start to pick up again, and we will doubtless see an overshoot. It is impossible to imagine that governments can somehow, with billions and trillions of dollars poured into the global situation, just somehow manage to bring the world around from catastrophe to a gentle 2 or 3% inflation in most developed parts of the world. What is much more likely is that we will see an overshoot, as I say, to 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, or 7% inflation, And that will then be offset by interest rates, which will rise rapidly. And we will then see ourselves, of course, go into another cycle. Cycles have always been with us. We had this strange period in the late 1990s and early 2000s of a relatively prolonged period of growth with a few glitches. One was the dot-com collapse. The second was September 11. But apart from that, and the small downturn in 2002-03, but apart from those things, the normal cycles will continue. And so watch this space. We're in for some very interesting times between now, April 2009, right through to maybe 2012-13, when we'll probably start to see things start to dip again. 14, 15, 16, recovery, and so on.